Louisiana, 1944. The afternoon heat pressed down on Camp Rustin like a wet blanket, thick enough to slow movement, to make breathing feel like work. Private First Class Robert Hayes pushed open the door to what he thought was an empty storage building, clipboard in hand, routine inspection on his mind. Then came the scream-high, panicked, unmistakably female. "We're Baden." The words meant nothing to him, but the sight did. 20 German women, ankle-deep in makeshift tubs, water glistening on shocked faces, arms crossing instinctively over bodies suddenly exposed. He froze. They froze. And in that suspended moment, everything both sides had been told about the enemy collided with devastating human reality. Camp Rustin sprawled across 300 acres of Louisiana pine forest, built in haste during the summer of 1942, when it became clear that America would need places to house the thousands of Axis prisoners flowing across the Atlantic. By late 1944, it held nearly 5,000 German captives, mostly men captured in North Africa and Italy, ordinary soldiers who de-surrendered to American forces and found themselves transported halfway around the world to a landscape that looked nothing like home. The women arrived in October. 43 German female auxiliaries, nurses and communications specialists captured during the Allied advance through France. They'd been processed through transit camps on the East Coast before being assigned to Rustin. The Army had determined that Louisiana's climate and isolation made it suitable for housing female prisoners who needed separation from the male POW population, but still required secure detention. The camp administration had scrambled to prepare. A section of the compound was hastily partitioned off, additional fencing erected, guard rotations adjusted to include women Army Corps personnel who could supervise female prisoners without the complications of male guards in constant close proximity. But the infrastructure remained makeshift at best. Buildings designed for male soldiers became women's barracks overnight. Facilities meant for men had to be repurposed, reimagined, made suitable for female prisoners through improvisation and the peculiar ingenuity of wartime necessity. Private First Class Robert Hayes, 22 years old from Minnesota, had been at Rustin for 8 months. He worked in supply and logistics tracking inventory, conducting building inspections, ensuring the vast apparatus of prisoner maintenance functioned smoothly. He'd grown accustomed to the routine monotony of camp life, the heat, the pine trees, the endless paperwork that accompanied even the simplest tasks, the strange reality of guarding men who seemed more relieved to be prisoners than angry about their capture. The arrival of female POWs had disrupted that routine. Suddenly, the camp buzzed with new complications, new protocols, new tensions. The male guards talked about them constantly, not with desire exactly, though that existed too, but with a kind of bewildered curiosity. German women, enemy women. How were they supposed to think about that? The propaganda had taught them to see Germans as faceless enemy, as brutal aggressors, as threats to be neutralized. But women complicated that narrative in ways no one had quite figured out how to process. The women themselves remained largely invisible. They kept to their segregated section, performing assigned work duties under WWII supervision, eating in a separate mess area, maintaining a distance that felt partly imposed and partly chosen. When male guards did see them crossing between buildings, working in the administrative offices, standing in formation during counts, they appeared tired, wary, determined to make themselves as unremarkable as possible. Among them was Margarethe Schrader, 26, who'd been a signals operator with a German field hospital unit before her capture near Caen. Tall, sharp-featured, her dark hair cropped short for practicality, she carried herself with rigid self-control that had been both survival strategy and shield. The regime's propaganda had promised terrible things if they were captured by American stories of mistreatment. Humiliation worse. The reality had been different, but not necessarily easier. They were treated correctly according to Geneva Convention standards. adequate food, medical care, shelter. But they remained prisoners, dependent on their captors for everything, stripped of agency and dignity in ways both obvious and subtle. The bathing situation exemplified the problem. The hastily converted women's section had shower facilities that were, at best, inadequate. Water pressure fluctuated wildly, heating was unreliable, and privacy was nearly non-existent. The WAC supervisors had arranged for the women to use a former equipment storage building that had been fitted with large galvanized tubs and a crude plumbing system, not showers exactly, but better than nothing. The women bathed in shifts, 20 at a time, while WAC guards maintained security outside. The arrangement worked until it didn't. November 12, 1944. The afternoon stretched long and humid, unusual warmth making everyone irritable and sluggish. Robert Hayes had a list of buildings to inspect, routine checks for maintenance issues, structural problems, anything that might require repair before winter properly arrived. The paperwork indicated Building 17C needed inspection, check roof integrity, verify window seals, confirm no water damage from recent storms. He'd done 100 such inspections. The routine was mindless. Arrive, check the exterior, enter through the main door, walk through noting any issues, mark the checklist, move to the next building. Building 17C sat at the edge of the women's section, but his paperwork showed it listed as storage empty, unused, low priority. No reason to expect anything unusual. The door wasn't locked. That should have been his first clue, but in the heat-induced haze of another tedious afternoon, he didn't register it as significant. He pushed the door open, clipboard raised, eyes scanning for roof leaks or foundation cracks. And the scream, "We're Baden! We're Baden!" His eyes adjusted from bright afternoon sunlight to dim interior shadow, and his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Women, 20 of them, standing in metal tubs filled with soapy water, in various states of undress, faces turning toward him with expressions of shock and outrage, and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. Time seemed to fracture. He registered details in rapid succession, steam rising from the tubs, the smell of soap and damp wood, towels draped over a makeshift line, clothing piled on wooden benches, and 20 pairs of eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin burn. "Oh God, I'm sorry, I didn't." He stumbled backward, words tripping over themselves, his face flaming red-hot despite the humidity. His clipboard clattered to the floor. "Rouse!" One of the women shouted, her voice sharp with authority. "Get out!" He got out, crashed through the door he'd just entered, nearly falling down the exterior steps in his haste to escape. Behind him, he heard rapid German, angry, frightened, words he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear. He stood outside, heart hammering, face burning with humiliation. WAC Corporal Janet Morrison appeared around the corner, drawn by the shouting. "Hayes? What the hell happened?" He gestured helplessly at Building 17C. "I was doing building inspection. The paperwork said storage. I didn't know, nobody told me." Morrison's expression shifted from confusion to horrified realization. "Oh no, that's the women's bathing facility. It wasn't on the restricted list." He pulled out his crumpled paperwork with shaking hands. Building 17C, storage, general use, inspect as scheduled. Nothing about restricted access. Nothing about female prisoners. Nothing that would have warned him he was about to walk into the single most mortifying moment of his military career. "Christ," Morrison muttered. "This is going to be a nightmare." She was right. Within an hour, the incident had generated a cascade of consequences that rippled through the camp's administrative structure like shockwaves from an explosion. Robert Hayes sat in the duty officer's quarters, still red-faced, while Captain William Brennan, camp security officer, tried to determine exactly what had happened and who was at fault. You're telling me you received official inspection orders for Building 17C? Yes, sir. Hayes handed over the paperwork, now damp from his sweating palms. Brennan examined it, his jaw tightening. This is from the October facility roster. Building 17C was redesignated in November when we converted it for the female prisoners. Someone in admin didn't update the inspection schedule. Sir, I had no way of knowing. I'm aware, Private. Brennan's tone suggested he was angry, but not necessarily at Hayes. This is an administrative failure, but it's also a serious breach of protocol. The women are understandably distressed. Distressed was putting it mildly. According to Morrison's report, several of the German women had refused to continue bathing, convinced that the incident had been deliberate, that American guards were spying on them, that their fears about mistreatment were being realized. The WAC supervisors were trying to calm them down, but the damage to whatever fragile trust existed between captors and captives had been significant. The thing is, Brennan continued, leaning back in his chair, this is exactly the kind of incident that can spiral into something much bigger. International Red Cross oversight, Geneva Convention complaints, diplomatic complications. We need to handle this correctly. Hayes felt his stomach sink. Am I being court-martialed, sir? No. Brennan's expression softened slightly. You followed your orders as written. But we need to address this with the female prisoners directly. They deserve an explanation and an apology. The idea of facing those women again made Hayes want to disappear into the Louisiana swamp. Sir, with respect, wouldn't it be better if... If what? If we sent someone else to apologize on your behalf? Brennan shook his head. These women have been subjected to years of propaganda, telling them American soldiers are monsters. Now one accidentally walks in on them bathing, and we respond by hiding him away? That confirms every terrible thing they've been taught to believe. No, Hayes, you're going to face them, apologize directly, and demonstrate that Americans take responsibility for our mistakes, even accidental ones. The meeting was arranged for the following morning in the women's section recreation room, a converted barracks space with mismatched furniture and barred windows. Hayes stood at attention in his cleanest uniform, feeling like he was facing a firing squad. Captain Brennan stood beside him, along with WAC Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who supervised the female prisoner detail. The German women filed in, 43 pairs of eyes ranging from hostile to wary to carefully neutral. They arranged themselves in rows, standing rather than sitting, maintaining the rigid military bearing that seemed instinctive. Hayes tried to keep his gaze respectfully forward, not making eye contact with any of them, especially not the 20 who'd been in Building 17C. Lieutenant Chun spoke first, in careful German, explaining the situation. Administrative error, outdated paperwork, complete accident. Then she nodded to Hayes. His prepared apology sounded hollow in his own ears. I sincerely apologize for yesterday's incident. It was completely unintentional. I had no idea Building 17C was being used as bathing facilities. I understand this was deeply distressing and violated your privacy. I take full responsibility for not ensuring my paperwork was current before conducting the inspection. Chun translated. The women's expressions didn't change. The silence felt suffocating. Then Margarethe Schrader stepped forward. She spoke in heavily accented but clear English, each word precisely pronounced. You expect us to believe this was accident? Hayes forced himself to meet her eyes. Yes, ma'am. I swear it was an accident. We have been told many things about American soldiers, she continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. We were told you would treat women prisoners with ... disrespect, with cruelty, that you would humiliate us. Yesterday, this seemed to prove what we feared. Ma'am, I understand why you'd think that, but now you apologize, she interrupted. You stand here in front of all of us, and you admit fault. You do not laugh. You do not make excuses. You do not say we are prisoners, and should expect no privacy. She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. This is not what we were told would happen. The room remained tense, but something had shifted slightly. Another woman spoke up in German, rapid, questioning. Chun translated. She wants to know what punishment you'll receive. Administrative reprimand, Captain Brennan answered. Private Hayes followed his written orders, so no formal disciplinary action. But the incident goes in his service record, and he's been reassigned away from any duties involving the women's section. More German discussion, words Hayes couldn't understand, but whose tone suggested debate, uncertainty. Margaretti spoke again, this time in German, and Chun's eyes widened slightly before she translated. She says if it was truly an accident, and if you've been punished for it, then they accept the apology. But they want assurance this won't happen again. You have my word, Brennan said formally, and I've personally reviewed every inspection schedule and restricted access list to ensure no similar errors occur. Building 17C is now clearly marked, locked during bathing times, and only WAC personnel have keys. Margaretti nodded slowly. She looked at Hayes directly, and he saw something complicated in her expression, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a tentative willingness to believe he was telling the truth. We accept, she said simply. The meeting ended, but something remained suspended in the air afterward, something Hayes couldn't quite name. He'd expected anger, accusations, demands for harsher punishment. Instead, he encountered something more nuanced: women who'd been prepared for the worst, but found something different when directly confronted, with evidence that their propaganda might have been wrong. The incident became camp legend within days, though the details shifted with each retelling. Some versions had Hayes deliberately spying on the women. Others had him accidentally stumbling into a full bathhouse riot. A few imagined romantic complications that bore no resemblance to reality. But the truth, mundane, awkward, deeply human, mattered more than the stories. For Hayes, the experience lingered like a low-grade fever. He couldn't stop thinking about Margaretti's words. This is not what we were told would happen. How many other things had they been told that were lies? What else did they believe about Americans that wasn't true? He started paying attention to the female prisoners in ways he hadn't before. Not with inappropriate interest, but with curiosity about their humanity. He watched them during the morning count, noted the way they stood in perfect formation, despite obvious exhaustion. He saw them working in the administrative building, translating German documents with meticulous attention to detail. He noticed how they maintained discipline and structure even in captivity, as if holding on to military bearing was the last thing they could control. 3 weeks after the incident, Hayes found himself working inventory in the supply building when Margaretti appeared with a requisition form. She stopped when she saw him, recognition flickering across her face. "Private Hayes," she said formally. "Ma'am." He felt his face heating again, the memory of humiliation still fresh. She held out the form. "We need additional blankets for women's barracks. Winter is coming and current allocation is insufficient." He took the form, examined it. "This needs Captain Brennan's signature." "I know, but I thought—" "Perhaps you could explain situation to him? He is more likely to approve if request comes from you." Hayes looked at her, surprised. "Why would you ask me?" "I'm the last person you'd want help from." Something that might have been a smile crossed her face, gone almost instantly. "Because you made mistake and admitted it. This is ... unusual in my experience with authority. I think perhaps you are a person who tries to do right thing, even when difficult." The compliment caught him off guard. "I'll talk to Captain Brennan. Make sure he understands the blankets are needed." "Thank you." She turned to leave, then paused. "Private Hayes? The women ... we talk about what happened. Some still believe it was deliberate, but most ... She searched for the English words. "Most think perhaps Americans are not what we were taught." "This is because you apologized. Because you looked ashamed. Because you treated us like we matter. After she left, Hayes sat with those words. Because you treated us like we matter. What kind of war had these women experienced that an accidental intrusion followed by an apology felt revolutionary? He went to Brennan that afternoon with a blanket requisition, explaining that the women's barracks really were undersupplied for approaching winter. Brennan approved it without hesitation, and Hayes coordinated the delivery through WAC personnel to avoid any further awkward encounters. But something had shifted in the camp's dynamic. The female prisoners began speaking more openly with their WAC supervisors, expressing concerns about inadequate heating, requesting additional work assignments to stay occupied, even asking for English language instruction. The rigid separation that had characterized the first month of their detention gradually loosened into something more functional. Lieutenant Chun noticed the change and mentioned it during a staff meeting. The German women are different lately. More communicative, less defensive. I think the bathing incident, oddly enough, helped break down some barriers. How so? Brennan asked. They expected the worst when it happened, Sean explained. Expected to be blamed, mocked, told it was their fault for existing. Instead, we took responsibility, apologized, and made changes to prevent it happening again. That violated everything their propaganda taught them about Americans. The camp chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, added his perspective. I've been visiting the women's section weekly, and several have started attending services. They tell me they're confused. The war taught them to hate Americans, but now they're experiencing treatment that doesn't match what they were told. It's created a kind of cognitive dissonance they're struggling to resolve. Hayes listened to these discussions with growing awareness that he'd accidentally participated in something larger than a single embarrassing incident. He'd become an involuntary agent of propaganda dissolution, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through simple human decency in the wake of a mistake. By December, the camp had settled into a new equilibrium. The female prisoners still maintained separation, still operated under strict protocols, but the atmosphere felt less hostile, less charged with mutual suspicion. Hayes occasionally crossed paths with Margaretti during administrative work, and their interactions were professionally cordial. She'd nod in acknowledgement. He'd return the gesture. Nothing dramatic, but something that suggested mutual recognition of shared humanity. One cold afternoon, Hayes was assigned to help distribute Christmas packages from the International Red Cross boxes of comfort items sent to POWs to improve morale during the holidays. The female prisoners received their allotment in the recreation room, and he found himself supervising the distribution alongside WAC personnel. Margaretti received her package, opened it carefully, and pulled out a bar of real German chocolate, a small luxury that must have cost significant resources to procure and ship. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. First taste of home in a long time, she said quietly, not really speaking to anyone in particular. Hayes understood what she meant. Home was gone, changed forever by war. But small things chocolate, familiar language, a memory of what had been could bridge the impossible distance for a moment. Merry Christmas, he said simply. She looked at him, and this time the smile was real, though touched by sadness. Thank you, Private Hayes, for everything. He knew she meant more than just the Christmas package. She meant the apology, the blankets, the small acts of decency that had helped her believe Americans might be more than the monsters she'd been taught to fear. Winter in Louisiana was mild compared to what the German women had known, but it still brought cold rains and occasional freezing nights that made the inadequately heated barracks uncomfortable. The women adapted with typical German efficiency organizing rotations to keep stoves stoked, sharing blankets, maintaining order through collective effort. The war news that filtered into camp told of Allied advances, German retreats, cities falling one after another. For the male POWs, this news brought resignation mixed with relief that the fighting was ending. For the women, it carried more complicated emotions, worry about families they couldn't contact, grief for a homeland being destroyed, uncertainty about what came after. Hayes noticed Margarethe growing quieter as winter progressed into early 1945. She still performed her duties efficiently, still maintained her careful composure, but something had changed. Father O'Brien mentioned during a casual conversation that several women were receiving Red Cross notification about family members missing, captured, lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse. One January afternoon, Hayes encountered Margarethe in the administrative building. She was sitting at a desk, staring at a piece of paper, tears streaming silently down her face. The other workers had gone for lunch, leaving her alone with grief she couldn't contain anymore. Hayes hesitated. Protocol said he should leave, fetch a WAC supervisor, maintain appropriate distance. But she looked so devastated, so completely broken, that protocol felt cruel. "Ma'am?" He approached carefully. "Is there anything ... Can I help?" She looked up, not bothering to wipe away tears. "My brother, Red Cross notification. Missing, presumed lost. Eastern Front." Hayes had no words adequate to that kind of loss. "I'm sorry. He was 19, she continued, her voice hollow. He did not want to fight. He wanted to be teacher like our father. But they took him anyway, sent him east, and now ... She gestured helplessly at the paper. "Now he is just missing. Not even confirmation of death. Just ... gone." Hayes sat down in the chair across from her, breaking every rule about fraternization. "My younger brother is in the Pacific. We haven't heard from him in 4 months. The not knowing, it's worse than anything." She met his eyes, and something passed between them, recognition of shared terror, the universal fear of those who wait while others fight. Enemy and victor disappeared in that moment, leaving just two people who understood what it meant to love someone the war might take. "How do you bear it?" she whispered. "Poorly," Hayes admitted. "I work. I try not to think about it. Sometimes I bargain with God in ways that probably don't make sense. Mostly, I just ... keep breathing until the next day." "Yes," she said softly, "breathing. This is all we can do." They sat in silence for a few minutes. Two people on opposite sides of a war neither had chosen, connected by grief that transcended nationality. Then Lieutenant Chun appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, and made a decision. "Hayes, you're needed in the supply building. I'll stay with Fräulein Schrader." He left reluctantly, but not before catching Margarethe's expression gratitude mixed with something that looked like surprised realization, that an American soldier had sat with her in grief, without judgment, without awkwardness, just simple human compassion. That evening, Father O'Brien approached Hayes during dinner. "Chun told me what happened today. That was a kind thing you did. I didn't really do anything. You treated her like a person instead of a prisoner," O'Brien corrected. "Sometimes that's everything." He paused, then added, "You know, I've been thinking about that bathing incident. At the time, it seemed like just an unfortunate mistake. But looking back, I think it was the best thing that could have happened for these women." "How so?" "Because it was genuinely accidental, followed by genuine accountability. It proved we're not what they were taught to fear. That proof opened doors, small ones, but doors nonetheless. Margarethe talks to me now about her struggles, her grief, her confusion about what comes next. She never would have done that if she still saw all Americans as enemies." Hayes thought about this. What happens to them when the war ends? "That's the question, isn't it?" O'Brien said quietly. "Germany is being destroyed. Even if their families survived, they're going home to ruins and occupation. Some won't have homes to return to." The thought haunted Hayes through the following weeks. He watched the women working, maintaining discipline, preserving their dignity despite everything, and wondered what future awaited them. They'd been taught to hate Americans, then captured by Americans, then treated with surprising decency by Americans. Where did that leave them when the war ended? Germany surrendered in May 1945. The news reached Camp Rustin on May 8th, and the reaction among prisoners was complex relief that the fighting was overmixed with despair about what surrender meant for their nation. The male prisoners gathered in subdued clusters, processing the reality of total defeat. The women retreated to their barracks and didn't emerge for evening count. Lieutenant Chun asked Hayes to accompany her when she went to check on them. They found the women sitting in silence, not crying, not talking, just sitting with the weight of everything they'd lost. Margaretti spoke for the group. "We are now prisoners of victorious nation. What happens to us?" "You'll be repatriated," Chun said gently. "Sent home when arrangements can be made. Probably within a few months." "Home to what?" another woman asked bitterly. "To cities that are rubble? To families who may be dead? To country that will be occupied for years?" Chun had no good answer. Neither did Hayes. They were witnessing the human cost of defeat in ways no propaganda had prepared anyone for. The repatriation process took longer than expected. Logistics of moving thousands of POWs across the Atlantic, combined with the chaos of post-war Europe, meant the women remained at Rustin through summer 1945. During those months, something unexpected happened. The line between captors and captives blurred further. With the war over, restrictions loosened slightly. The women were permitted more freedom within the camp, could attend religious services with male prisoners, participated in structured recreation activities supervised by WWII personnel. They remained technically prisoners, but the atmosphere shifted from detention to temporary refuge. Hayes continued working in supply and administration, and his interactions with Margaretti became more frequent. She'd been assigned to help translate repatriation documents, work that brought her into contact with American staff regularly. Their conversations remained professionally appropriate, but a genuine respect had developed, not friendship exactly, but something beyond mere tolerance. One August afternoon, while reviewing shipping manifests for the women's transport, Margaretti said suddenly, "I have been thinking about the bathing incident." Hayes felt his face heat. "I really am still sorry about that." "I know. That is not why I mention it." She set down her pen, looking at him directly. "At the time, I was convinced it was deliberate, that you had come to humiliate us, to prove we were powerless. This is what propaganda taught us to expect. And now? Now, I understand it was simply human error. And your response, the immediate apology, the willingness to face us, the changes made to prevent repetition, has taught me something more important than the incident itself." "What's that?" She chose her words carefully. "That Americans are not monsters. That you make mistakes like anyone else, but you also try to fix them. That perhaps everything I was taught about America was as false as what you were probably taught about Germany." Hayes considered this. "I don't know what I thought about Germans before the war. They were just ... abstract enemies. Then I met actual Germans, and they were just people. Tired, scared, complicated people trying to survive something terrible." "Yes," Margaretti said softly. "This is what war does. It tries to make us forget we are all just people. But sometimes, in strange ways, humanity breaks through. Even when we do not expect it." The women's transport was finally scheduled for September. Hayes helped coordinate the logistics, arranging supplies for the journey, processing paperwork, ensuring every detail met international standards. The night before their departure, there was an informal gathering in the recreation room, not a celebration, but an acknowledgement that this strange chapter was ending. Father O'Brien gave a brief blessing. Lieutenant Chun thanked the women for their cooperation during their detention. Captain Brennan formally notified them that their status as prisoners of war would officially end upon their arrival in Germany, though they would remain under Allied occupation authority. Then Margaretti stood, speaking in clear English she'd refined over the past year. We wish to thank the staff of Camp Rustin. When we arrived, we were frightened. We expected cruelty. We expected humiliation. We found instead correct treatment according to international law. And sometimes, she glanced at Hayes, we found simple human decency that reminded us we were still people deserving of dignity. She continued in German, and one of the translators rendered it into English. We do not know what awaits us in Germany. We know our country committed terrible acts. We know we returned to ruins and occupation. But we also know, because of our time here, that Americans can be fair, that perhaps the future will not be as dark as we feared. The room was silent when she finished. Then Lieutenant Chun began clapping, and others joined in a strange moment of acknowledgement that transcended the victor-defeated dynamic. The next morning, Hayes was assigned to the transport detail. He helped the women load onto buses that would take them to the port, watched them board with their few possessions in Red Cross-issued bags. Margarethe was one of the last to board, and she paused at the bus steps. "Private Hayes, ma'am, I hope your brother returned safely from the Pacific." "He did, 3 weeks ago. Thank you for asking. And I hope ... doppelquotes," she trailed off, searching for words. "I hope you remember that the German women you met were not the enemy. We were just people caught in history we did not choose." "I'll remember," Hayes promised. "And I hope you remember that Americans aren't monsters. We're just people too, trying to do our best." She smiled, the first truly unguarded smile he'd seen from her. "Because of you, I believe this now." She boarded the bus. Hayes stood with the other staff members and watched the convoy drive toward the camp gates, carrying 43 women back toward an uncertain future in a defeated nation. Captain Brennan appeared beside him. "You know, that bathing incident, I put it in my report as an example of how mistakes can become opportunities. Sir, those women arrived expecting the worst. If we'd been perfect professional, distant, impeccably appropriate, they might have respected us, but never trusted us. But you made a very human mistake, and we responded with very human accountability. That taught them more about American values than any amount of proper protocol could have." Hayes thought about this. "So you're saying walking in on 40 women bathing was good?" Brennan laughed. "I'm saying that how we respond to our failures matters more than trying to appear infallible. You showed them we make mistakes, but own them. That's a powerful lesson, especially for people who'd been taught Americans were brutal conquerors." Robert Hayes served out his enlistment and returned to Minnesota in 1946. He rarely spoke about his time at Camp Rustin, except to note that he de-guarded German POWs in Louisiana. When pressed, he'd mentioned the bathing incident as a funny story, embarrassing, sure, but ultimately harmless. But in private moments, he thought often about Margarethe and the other women. He wondered if they made it safely back to Germany, what they found there, whether they rebuilt lives from the ruins of defeat. He wondered if they remembered the American private who accidentally intruded on their privacy and then apologized with genuine humiliation. Years later, in 1963, Hayes received a letter forwarded through Veterans Affairs, a shot-in-the-dark attempt by someone searching for an American soldier who'd been at Camp Rustin in 1944-45. The writer was Margarethe Schrader, now Margarethe Weber, living in Munich with her husband and 2 children. She wrote, "I have often thought about my time as prisoner in Louisiana. Those months were frightening and uncertain, but they were also transformative. I learned that enemies could show compassion, that mistakes could lead to understanding, that humanity could survive, even war's attempts to destroy it. I wanted you to know that your kindness both in the incident, I'm sure you'd rather forget, and in the difficult months that followed, helped me believe in the possibility of peace and reconciliation." Hayes wrote back. They corresponded for several years, their letters bridging the impossible distance between wartime enemies who'd become, if not friends, than something like witnesses to each other's humanity. In his final letter before his death in 1989, Hayes wrote, "I've thought a lot about that day. I walked into Building 17C. At the time, it was the most embarrassing moment of my life. But looking back, maybe it was the most important. Not because of what I did, which was just a stupid mistake, but because of what happened after. Because we treated you and the other women like people who deserved dignity, even in defeat. Because that small act of decency helped crack the wall of propaganda and hate. Because it proved that even in war, human connection is possible." Margarete kept that letter. When she died in 2001, her daughter found it among her mother's papers, along with a photograph taken at Camp Rustin in 1945-43. German women standing in front of a Louisiana pine forest, their expressions guarded, but no longer terrified. Survivors of a war that had tried and failed to completely destroy their humanity. The bathing incident became a footnote in Camp Rustin's history, mentioned occasionally in academic studies of POW treatment during World War II. Most accounts treated it as a minor administrative error, barely worth noting in the vast machinery of wartime prisoner management. But for the people involved, for Robert Hayes and Margarete, Schrader and the other women who lived through that awkward, terrifying, ultimately humanizing moment, it remains something more. Proof that even enemy nations are made of ordinary people, that mistakes matter less than how we respond to them. That dignity survives defeat when victors choose compassion over cruelty. That sometimes, in the strangest ways, a simple apology can begin to heal the wounds of war. The camps closed. The prisoners went home. The war receded into history. But the moment when an American soldier accidentally walked in on German women bathing, and then stood before them the next day to apologize with genuine shame, that moment lingered. Not as propaganda, not as victory, not even as justice. Just as proof that underneath uniforms and flags and ideologies, everyone was still human, still capable of embarrassment and grace, still deserving of dignity, even in the most awkward circumstances. Still, fundamentally and irreducibly, just people trying to survive history together. The door opened. The women screamed. The soldier apologized. And in that collision of vulnerability and accountability, something small but significant shifted, not the war itself, but the people trapped inside it. "We're baden. We're bathing." The words meant nothing to him in that moment. But over time, they came to mean everything: a reminder that even enemies deserve privacy, that mistakes don't have to be unforgivable, that human decency can survive even the machinery of war, that sometimes the most important moments in history are the ones where we simply treat each other like people who matter, even especially when we've been taught not to.